You sent a draft chapter or section to your supervisor a few weeks ago, and now it's come back and it is covered in comments and changes and suggestions. It's like, oh my goodness. And some of the comments are quite, shall we say, direct, like, what are you on about here? Why have you done this? Why is this missing? Why is that missing? And unless you have incredibly thick skin, that is going to stink, but it doesn't have to. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Yardley, and I've been supporting PhD students for the last 20 years. In that time, I have given a lot of feedback. I've also changed the way that I give feedback in response to feedback about the feedback. It's all very meta. But the point I really want to get to is that feedback is crucial for your development as a PhD student. It's how you learn, it's how you grow, it's how you reach your potential. But my goodness, sometimes the feedback can make you want to cry, can't it? Let's be honest. And because feedback is so important and it's something that you can get an awful lot out of if you deal with it in the right way, I wanted to make a video about it. So in this video, I'm going to be looking at how you can change the way you think about feedback so it doesn't hurt so much, how you can change the way you think about your supervisor so the feedback that you receive from them doesn't negatively impact your relationship with them, and thirdly, how to ask for the feedback that you need, which isn't necessarily the same as the feedback that you want, but I'll explain more about that when we get to it. Okay, let's get into it. So firstly, how to change the way you think about feedback. Now, some students really dread getting feedback. They really do. And that's because their supervisors approach feedback in a particular way. Some supervisors really go to town on the feedback, and there's a tendency to emphasise the negative, to only focus on the things that students have done wrong, or they haven't done particularly well, or they haven't done at all. And when you receive a draft with this kind of feedback on it, with things taken out, things moved around, extensive comments in the margins, some of them which really sting, it can be quite overwhelming. And just note that you are not alone if you have recently had some feedback like this, because I hear from lots of people all the time that the feedback they get from their supervisors, they're just completely kind of blown away by it. So if that is you, write blown away in the comments and you will be able to see from that comment section that you are not alone. The first thing that I'd say to you is, if you receive feedback like this, don't do anything about it immediately. Just have a read through it and kind of take it in and absorb it and digest it, but don't actually do anything. I would leave it perhaps 24 hours before you start to act on that feedback, because when we receive feedback that is really, it feels like a kind of personal insult to us, we have a tendency to kind of overreact and for emotion to kind of override what we do about it. So best to just take a step back. So 24 hours, just put it to one side and leave it. Once you've had a little bit of space and you're ready to go back and take a look at it and do constructive things with it, the first thing we need to do is change how you're thinking about the feedback. So there is a tendency sometimes when you receive a draft that just highlights the negative to really internalize that and think, oh my goodness, look at all of the stuff that I did wrong. I am so rubbish at this. I feel really despondent. What you need to do here is take the ego out of it. Ego is not your amigo when it comes to feedback, okay? And you need to think, okay, this feedback is on the work. It is on the draft. It's on the chapter. It's on the section. It is not feedback about me. It's feedback about the work. This is about your written work. This is not about you. And it's easy to feel personally insulted when somebody criticises something that you've done that's related to your PhD, because your PhD is something that you're passionate about, that you're interested in, that really is very much a part of your identity. But you have got to be really clear that the feedback is on the work, it is not on you. Okay, your worth as a human being, your worth as an individual does not depend on the quality of this particular piece of written work that you've done. So you just need to kind of get that into your mind from the outset. So the feedback is on the draft. The feedback is not about you or your worth or value as a human being. Okay? Next up, we're going to change how we think about our supervisor. It is perfectly natural to feel quite towards your supervisor when they have just pointed out everything that you've done wrong. Okay, that is a perfectly natural reaction. It's like you're the child and they're the parent, and you start feeling really resentful towards them because you're like, oh my goodness, you only focus on all the negative stuff that I do and I work really hard on that, and you didn't kind of provide me with any validation for having worked hard on that, and I just feel really yuck towards you right now. You need to stop that and reframe it and start seeing your supervisor as somebody who is invested in you, somebody who believes in you. This is someone who believes in you so much that they have taken quite a considerable amount of time to go through your draft and highlight all of the ways in which you can take that really good work that you've done and make it even better. If you have a tendency to think they've got it in for me when you receive a draft like this, you need to know that that really is not true. Okay, when a supervisor provides really detailed feedback, even if it is feedback that focuses all on the negative, that is a sign that they are invested in you, that they believe in you, that you matter, that your contribution to this field, to this discipline matters. Because if they didn't feel like that, they would not take the time to do this, okay? They would not take the time to go through your work with a magnifying glass. And one thing that I always say to people is I am always very suspicious of the supervisors who get a draft from a student and just go, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, it's fine. You don't need to do anything. That should be okay. Because that tells me that person hasn't looked at it, or that person has looked at it for like 10 minutes, you know, between one coffee and then the next lecture or whatever. The people who take the time to go through things, to provide you with detailed feedback, even if that feedback does kind of sting a little bit, they really are invested in you. They really do care about you. And yes, they have a funny way of showing it, but we're going to get on to that in the next section in terms of how you can actually start impacting upon the type of feedback that you receive. So asking for the feedback you need, that's what we're going to look at now. When it comes to asking for the feedback that you need to be really clear with your supervisor when you send them a draft, what it is that you want them to focus on. So you might want them to pay particular attention to your understanding of a particular theory or a particular concept, rather than commenting on any of the other stuff there. You also want to be really clear what you don't want them to look at. So you might say to them before you give them your draft, look, the structure is all over the place here, and I'm going to sort that out later. I just need to know that the content is okay. Be really clear with them. Say, I'd prefer it if you focused on this particular element of this draft rather than looking at this thing. If you don't do that, they are probably going to give you feedback on everything, okay? And that is what happens when you get your draft back and it's absolutely saturated with comments and track changes and all kinds of really overwhelming stuff. That is often because they have just looked at everything. And you might not want them to have looked at everything. So you've got all of this stuff that you know is a problem anyway, that you know you're going to have to address at some point, but you're going to do that later on down the road. And it can be quite difficult sometimes to pick out the comments that you need at this stage, that you need to develop this specific element of your work. So when you're really clear with them, this is what I want you to give me feedback on, this is what I want you to just leave alone for now. It just makes it much more efficient when it comes to improving those drafts when you get them back. You haven't got to wade through loads of comments and loads of changes that you really didn't want them to make. Also think about the format that you want to receive feedback in and communicate this to your supervisor. Now, in the field that I work in, there is a tendency to use track changes, in MS Word. And I will make track changes on documents that my students give me if they've asked for that. But you've got to be aware that track changes, that is not the only form of feedback that you can receive. So if that is something that isn't particularly helpful to you, or it's not particularly helpful for this specific piece of work you're doing at the moment, think about some alternatives. One thing you could propose to your supervisor is a voice memo. So if you want them to take a look at your document and go through it on a screen and then record a voice memo as they go, kind of talking you through it, that would be perfectly fine. So perhaps that's something you might want to think about. Maybe a summary email with bullet points. So say you don't actually want any comments on the document itself, but you just want them to read through it and give you some high level feedback that isn't going to require lots of kind of meddling around with the structure and leaving comments in the margins. Maybe you just want an email with 4 or 5 bullet points in it. Tell them that if that's going to be helpful. And sometimes you might just want to go back to basics and have a face-to-face chat with them where they've got your draft, they've got it, on a screen or in hard copy, and they can just talk you through particular elements of it. And they might have made some comments in the margin, but they're going to actually explain that to you verbally rather than sending you a document or a voice memo or whatever. So I think the point that I really want to get across here is that feedback doesn't just have to be in one format. And there is a tendency to sometimes slip into a bit of a habit with feedback. And I speak as a PhD supervisor myself here. A few years ago, I would be track changes all the way. But in response to what my own students told me in terms of what they would find helpful at this particular stage or for this particular chapter, I've changed it up a bit. And I always ask when people send me things to comment on, how would you like to receive feedback on this? And if you are a student with a supervisor who used to be like I was, a bit track change balmy, and that is something that you don't really want at this point in time, go and ask them for an alternative. Ask them for a voice memo, ask them for an email with bullet points in, ask them for just a face-to-face chat. But you have got to take control here. You have got to be the one that asks for the feedback that you need. So to sum up, coping with feedback that tends to sting, how do we kind of get past that? Well, firstly, change the way that you think about feedback. Secondly, change the way you think about your supervisor after you've received that kind of feedback. And thirdly, learn to ask for the feedback that you need, and don't be afraid to tell your supervisor what's helpful and what's not helpful, because that is going to benefit your relationship with them overall. So go and do those things. Let me know how you get on in the comments, and I will see you in my next video.